Namaskar and welcome to Sunset Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the global oil crisis, or rather the fallout of Russia-Ukraine conflict on the oil trade and the availability of oil and gas products across the globe. Now, amidst ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine and tightened sanctions on Moscow by Western countries led by United States, Brent crude futures surged to $118.22 per barrel in London, the highest level since February 2013. Brent crude makes up for more than half of the world's globally traded supply of crude oil. Meanwhile, OPEC and non-OPEC partners, an influential energy alliance known as OPEC Plus, agreed on Wednesday to stick to their plans of a small output rise in April. Russia is the world's largest exporter of oil to global markets and the second largest crude oil exporter behind Saudi Arabia. The share of Russian gas supplies to EU region has increased significantly from 25% of the total gas demand there in 2009 to 32% in 2021. So what will be the fallout of Russia-Ukraine conflict on the global oil and energy markets, and what can be done to tackle the challenges arising out of the situation? For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel today. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Shubhmoy Bhattacharjee, who is here with us, consulting editor, The Business Standard. Welcome, Shubhmoy. We are also joined by Mr. R.S. Sharma, former CMD of ONGC, and Mr. Saurabh Chandra, former secretary in the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. Welcome, both of you gentlemen, as well to Sunset Television. I'll begin with you, Mr. Saurabh Chandra, and let's first start by understanding the scope of the issue here. Specifically, we would like to understand how serious is the situation when we are looking at the oil and energy markets across the globe and these challenges which are arising due to the ongoing conflict and the economic sanctions as well?
There is great apprehension. The sanctions up to now have been primarily aimed at crippling the Russian economy and their financial systems. The assets of their central bank have been frozen. Fortunately, the oil and gas exports have not been hit as yet. Russia exports about between 4.5 million barrels per day to 5 million barrels per day of oil. Now, if that gets affected, it would mean disrupting the demand-supply balance significantly. In the short run, there is little that one can do to make up this shortfall. One way is that let's get Iran back into the market. It'll help to some extent. Some of these countries like Saudi Arabia have the potential to produce more. Even UAE, which has been exporting very large quantities of crude oil, they can be persuaded to produce more, but there would still be a gap. And this will be reflected on the prices. India does not import too much crude oil or gas from Russia, but the prices will affect it. Now, when it comes to gas, if the gas supplies to Europe are reduced, they will have to perforce depend on imported LNG. Now, where will this LNG come from? Qatar is the second largest exporter of gas and the largest exporter of LNG. Now, if some of these supplies are diverted from other markets, which are the Asian markets, then the Asian countries would be impacted. And of course, there would be an impact on the prices. Most of India's import of LNG is on the long-term contracts. Spot prices do affect imports. But if this gas supply is diverted, we may suffer some kind of impact on the import of LNG. Today, gas imports are about 50% of India's domestic production, domestic requirement. So that is where we are. But I hope good sense prevails. Oil and gas exports from Russia are not brought under sanctions.
Okay. Mr. R.S. Sharma, your assessment of the global situation which we're witnessing right now with the oil and gas or rather energy markets there, and also do you concur with what Mr. Chandra is referring to, that as far as India is concerned, we might feel the ripple effects, not the direct push of this particular situation?
Firstly, I absolutely agree with what Chandra Saab has said. And it's not a ripple effect. We are perhaps amongst the most vulnerable economy getting adversely affected with the rising crude prices. Let me go little earlier than this Ukraine problem. As you would have noticed, the crude prices had been inching up slowly and slowly. They had reached $90. That time there was no Ukraine crisis. Ukraine crisis has only taken it to crossing $100 and then yesterday crossing $120. It has only accentuated the problem. Even before that, crude prices are moving up. Reason being, right now the demand has come back to the pre-COVID level, almost 100 million barrels a day. The supply has not been able to keep pace in the sense that their spare capacity has been shrinking.
Okay.
And I was just reading the statement from the OPEC, the chairman, Mr. Barkindo, telling that this climate lobby has taken the oil industry under siege. That means there's so much of campaign. There are no investments happening for increasing the oil and gas production.
Okay.
The lenders are not advancing money to the producers of oil and gas. So that kind of lobby has been responsible for the prices moving from $65, $70 to $90+. And now this Ukraine problem has accentuated. And today the situation, perhaps we are not realizing. Somehow the government is keeping it camouflage. Let's see how the things unfold next week after the last phase of the UP election. So perhaps we are in for 10 to 12 rupees per litre increase in the prices of petrol and diesel, and that the cascading effect on the entire economy, the exchange rate, the balance of trade, the inflation, and even otherwise the fiscal deficit.
Okay.
All-round implications, adverse implications are going to be there, which are under wraps as of now. So I'm perhaps, maybe I may sound a pessimist, but I'm extremely worried of the current situation so far as its impact on India, because India imports 85-86% of its consumption requirement for oil and 55% or so about the gas.
Okay.
So we are heavily dependent on imports.
Okay. Indeed, this is a matter of concern, and you're right there, Mr. Sharma, something which Mr. Chandra was also referring to. I'd like to bring in Shubhmoy here. Shubhmoy, as both the gentlemen are pointing out, when we look at the global scenario, of course, there will be, all of this is interconnected. And a closer look at a closer scrutiny of the Western sanctions against Russia also revealed that the SWIFT platform ban for the Russian banks has left out certain banks which were dealing, or rather, which were responsible for the trade in oil and gas energy. So there is some space left out there. It's not, a complete all-out push as far as the oil and global energy markets are concerned.
That's right. I mean, that's a very good point that you're raising, Vishal. I take on board what Mr. R.S. Sharma and Mr. Saurav Chandra are saying. But let me put it this way. A war might have a humanitarian issues and all that, that's different. But a war between oil-producing countries is a very good opportunity for oil producers to make profit. Essentially, the oil-producing countries of OPEC are making up for their huge budget deficits of the past few years. It is not, I don't agree that because of the lack of investment, yes, sure, there is a lack of investment, but just because of that, prices are rising. They essentially are making a good profit. IMF scenario of Saudi Arabia had shown a massive fiscal deficit for Saudi Arabia in 2020. They've covered it up. It's been a good time for them. But what does that mean for India? Are we in a very bad situation? Let me put it this way. First of all, if you look at the numbers, and the interesting thing about these numbers is that if you look at our current oil deficit in a normal year, it roughly is about $105 billion. If oil goes up to about 100, we shall be broadly be, because we also export refinery products, we'll be broadly about $140 billion worth of deficit on oil. To balance that, what do we get? We've got a goods trade deficit. So our goods trade deficit will not balance it, it'll actually add to it. So we will have about $240 to $250 billion worth of deficit there. What does it get recovered by? One, we are a net exporter of services. We have a surplus, roughly about $110 billion. We get remittances of about $80 billion. So together, if you look at all these things, what essentially we will get is our current account deficit will be roughly be about between $80 to $90 billion, even with oil at $100 billion. And the important thing to look at it is this is for the entire year.
Okay.
A 5-day of war does not change this math. Only if this math continues, if oil continues to be above 100, even though Brent futures are looking, as you pointed out, at 118, if it continues for 3 months, 4 months, then this math gets all right.
Okay.
But even then, remember, what will happen? We get FDI, we get FPI. FDI, roughly, we get about $45 billion. FPI, we get about $25 billion. So roughly, then that gets balanced. So essentially, it is not that sort of a scare scenario. We should, if you look at it, because what happens to rupee will be determined by the balance of payment condition.
Okay.
The balance of payment condition is where we would be looking at to see whether the entire economy is going to get into a tailspin.
Okay.
So there are two things there. One is going to be the foreign exchange reserves. Secondly, as this math that I told you about will essentially also mean that while things can get bad, they are not that cataclysmic for us to say, oh my God, we have really been had it.
Okay.
That's not the point. I mean, that's why I thought I'll be putting in these figures in the perspective.
These figures and numbers, obviously, they put a lot of things in perspective as well. But Saurabhji, do you agree with what Shubhmo is pointing out here? And the crux, it seems like that for the short term, as Mr. Sharma was referring to it, there is a concern, there is a worry. But if you look at the mid-term or the long term, we might feel the pinch if this drags out for a longer period. Not the conflict or the sanctions, but their impact on the prices, crude oil prices.
You see, this war will end one day. But what we should be looking at is the day after the war ends and the day after. Now, if these sanctions continue, there will be an impact, an impact. It will not only be confined to oil. If CATSA kicks in on S-400 and other military hardware, we have a problem. So there is a problem, and the government is aware of it and is tackling it.
Okay.
The other figure that is relevant is that the budget was actually constructed on a crude oil price of about $72 to $75.
Indeed, the economic survey does mention that.
Now, if this average price goes up to 110, then the budget maths will have to be redone. Let's look at the domestic market. How high can the petrol and diesel prices go? Where will the excise duty cuts kick in? Where will the VAT revenues get kicked in? But if there is a loss of revenue, how will it be made up? Through additional debt, which means that in the long term, prices will go up. It will affect the monetary policy. So it's a difficult situation. The policy makers are going to face a very challenging time, but I'm sure they'll come out of it.
Okay.
We just hope that this war closes quickly. Some of these sanctions are rolled back, and the oil and gas prices do not hit the ceiling. We import about 150 billion barrels in a year,
Okay.
roughly 4.5 per day. And if you were to multiply it by a price of about $100, it means an import price of $150 billion. So 1.5 billion, sorry, not 150, 1.5 multiplied by
billion.
100. So if it's 120, this 150 becomes $210 billion. So we'll have to find money for it.
Okay, okay. So the entire calculation will have to be relooked at. Mr. Sharma, your views there on the mitigating steps, because we have flagged out the challenges here. You've also pointed out why we need to be cautious or concerned or worried about it. Mr. Chandra is also pointing out to it. Shubhmoy gave some interesting and important figures to make us understand as to why it is going to pinch us. But what is it that we can do, or what is it the global community should do? Because it's just not us who is going to feel the pinch.
Very, very difficult to answer that question because, as I perhaps mentioned, it is easy to start a war. It's not easy to stop it. Russia perhaps thought that in a matter of 3-4 days, they will capture Kiev and overthrow the regime, and that's it. Change of regime, and that will be the over. But unfortunately, it is not going that way. There are bigger threats coming about use of nuclear weapons and other implications, cascading effect for the global community and this sort of war. In fact, prior to this, we never had in the last 70 years this kind of war.
Okay.
Where if you look at the Iraq invasion or kind of other conflicts after India, Pakistan 1970 war, we did not have any war on this large scale. And now the current, the armaments and current resources the countries are having, it is getting bad to worse.
Okay.
So I'm deeply worried about the entire situation, and particularly about the oil and gas. So as it was clarified that right now this payment mechanism SWIFT has spared some of the banks which are dealing with the receipt of payments against this oil and gas. But in a situation like this, you don't know if those things also get curtailed, then there's a bigger crisis.
Okay.
And let me tell you, in case the Russian supplies do not come to the market, the rest of the world market, the suppliers, the producers, they are not in a position to meet the shortfall.
Okay.
So the prices are going to get flared up. We have seen with a matter of 3-4 days moving from mid-90s to this crossing 120. And if it continues like this, it will not be surprised that crossing 150 or so. So that is a really pretty difficult scenario even to think about it.
Okay.
So somehow I am deeply worried about how the situation is unfolding.
Indeed.
So tomorrow perhaps is going to be more challenging. Next week for the government to manage the petroleum product prices is going to be more challenging. In case they restore whatever excise duty increases they had done in 2020 when the prices had crashed, if they reduce those excise duty on petrol and diesel, so the government is losing revenue of about almost 90,000 crores. So from where that shortfall is going to be met? So inflation, cascading effect, fiscal deficit. So to my mind, we have more difficult situation to face in times to come.
Okay. Okay. Shubhmoy, in terms of what needs to be done and how it can be done, of course, Mr. Sharma is right. We've seen how things have changed rapidly over the past 10-15 days, and it's a rapidly evolving situation as well. Things might change with sanctions, things might change on the war front as well. But as Mr. Chandra was referring to, that we'll have to look at the day after the war ends, or perhaps the next day as well, and near future and the long-term future as well. So, what is it that can be done by, of course, the producing countries? That's one, oil-producing countries, and importers, net importers like us.
Well, let's put it. I mean, I quite like what Mr. Chandra was saying about looking at the war the day after. What I I mean, we talked about the figures. First of all, as we say, this has to continue for a year or at least 6 months for the figure to look really that bad. That's first thing. Second thing, are we the guys who are in the war zone? No, we are not. What is India's problem? India's problem from this war is only one, that our oil bill can rise. And sure enough, it will rise. We are all agreed on that. But let's look at it. Are any of the Russian oil fields under threat, unlike in the Iraq war?
No.
Or in the Iran war? So the world's oil
at least
production,
not yet.
I mean, Ukraine will have to cover a considerable distance and USA will have to fight to be able to put out those oil wells in the Urals. That's not happening. If that happens, then that's a different thing. So essentially, the world's oil production capacity, whatever it is, it's not been disturbed anywhere. The second part is, once, let's assume the worst, let's assume Russia collapses. What will happen? The United Nations or somebody mandate will come in to run the country, and what will be the first thing that they'll do? They'll make the oil come into the market. If more oil comes to the market for revitalization of the country, what happens to that country, we are not concerned. But that oil comes into the market, isn't it? And that eases the world supply. So essentially, right now, what you're getting is a short-term crisis, which has basically been created by the OPEC guys, because they are creating the advantage that, look, guys, we have the advantage of a short-term disruption, so let's make the most of it.
Okay.
India is the third largest importer of oil and gas. Obviously, today is in a far different situation from what it was in the early 90s or in the earlier oil shocks. There we were price takers. Here we can flex our muscles. We can do lots of things. One of the things is, for instance, if the SWIFT problem is there, that doesn't affect us. That's for payment to Russia. That's Russia's problem. Nobody is stopping our payments from going through. If Russia, again, was assuming the worst, Russia goes under, something happens disastrously, the sanctions stay, what happens to that slush of money across the world that's floating in the world international markets? A lot of it will leave Russia and come to India. So we have larger FPIs coming into India. There are shortages across happening in the world in terms of wheat export. Indian wheat exports will rise. Ukraine and Russia were the greatest exporters of wheat.
Indeed.
If they aren't able to do it, we will be doing it.
So
we
that's
are the
an
largest
opportunity
exporters
there.
of steel. We will be exporting it. We have got surplus capacity. Earlier periods, we didn't have this capacity. Now we have the surplus sitting in our factories. So we can actually ramp it up. Sure, there will be inflation. The inflation which comes through by the rising price of oil. That is always there. But accepting that, and to that extent, if it's managed, and that's a question of how much the government wants to let the consumer take in the pressure, and how much the government says, let my budget soak in the pressure. There's no particular reason why the 6.9% fiscal deficit has to stay at 6.9. It can go up to 7.2, 7.3. It's a post-COVID year. We know, and with this thing, it can happen. So the government soaks in the pressure. So what exactly are the risks for India?
Okay.
To my mind, the risks this time are actually much lower, sir. Rather, we stand to configure a large part of the oil economy of the world because we are the guys who can decide.
Okay.
We are the second largest or third largest buyers. We have got the largest refinery production capacity. If any of the Russian refineries and others are knocked out, in fact, they don't have much, again, it's an advantage for us.
Okay.
So I don't see, concerns are a lot on the oil front. But leaving that out, I don't see why we should be feeling that we are going into trouble.
Okay.
I mean, rather, I would think that there's an opportunity that India can encash in terms of its commodity exports.
Okay.
And that is what I think is a big takeaway at this
Okay,
time.
that's a very interesting aspect, and we're running short of time. But I'd like to take a quick concluding comment from you, Mr. Chandra, on this aspect, which Shubhmoy is referring to. That of course there is a concern. Of course, we might or will feel the pinch in terms of rising prices and we will have to rework our budgetary mathematics as well. But then there are opportunities hidden in this as well. Perhaps if they can be worked upon and cashed upon rightly, we might offset the the shock which we are getting, the crude shock.
To a small extent, yes, but nothing major.
Okay.
We cannot set prices of oil and gas in the international market. We are a price taker. We continue to suffer an Asian premium from Saudi Arabia. Not all our efforts have helped.
Mm-hmm.
We try to have a coalition of importing countries which could perhaps bargain for better prices. It's not worked for crude oil. And we did bargain for better prices for LNG from Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a major issue. If we are going to import about 1.5 billion barrels of oil in a year, a $10 increase means another $15 billion.
Okay.
Now, to what extent can we make up that through increased exports is a question which is very debatable.
Mm-hmm.
Let us not forget one thing, that outside the oil exporting countries, the biggest trade surplus countries are the manufacturing giants.
Mm-hmm.
Germany, Korea, China, Japan. Unfortunately, we are still not a manufacturing giant. And our exports of manufacturers is not very high.
Okay.
The new schemes, PLI scheme, and the other scheme that the government has put on the table, in the future can make us a bigger exporter of manufactured goods.
Okay.
Wheat export, etc., we can only do to a limited extent.
Okay.
But let us not forget that we also get a lot of sunflower oil from.
Indeed. That's also a challenge area.
And Russia. And what happens to this? The oil prices, the edible oil prices will go up.
Okay.
And we all do import a lot of it. So a holistic picture would mean that we just hope good sense continues to prevail. Oil and gas is not brought under sanctions.
Okay. That's of course the best hope we can have. Thank you so much, Mr. Saurabh Chandra, Mr. R.S. Sharma, and Shubhmoy as well for sharing your views and insight with us and our viewers. As our experts were pointing out, this is the gist of what's happening in the global oil and energy markets and the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the sanctions on Russia by the Western world. Of course, India has its own concerns and worries as well. We might feel a pinch to a certain extent, but then there are processes and strategies which are being thought about and perhaps will be put in place to tackle those challenges as well. We'll keep you updated on all those. Meanwhile, we'll take your leave and come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sunset Television. Thank you.